So hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation with the curators. I'm Amanda Dubberly. I'm the assistant curator and academic liaison at the William Benton Museum of Art. And I'm here today with Professor Robert Thorson, who curated the exhibition that we have up in the museum and also online right now, the human epic living in the Anthropocene. So before we get started, a little housekeeping and also a little information about the format. You will see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so this is a place where you can pose questions. Please keep in mind that everyone who's participating in the webinar will see your question, and they will also see that you asked the question. So just keep that in mind. We will get to questions during the Q&A part of the webinar. So the format will be two 10 to 15 minute presentations with images, just talking a little bit about the exhibition and also about the course that it supports. And then we'll open it up to your questions and maybe have some questions for each other as well. So before we launch into the presentations, I will introduce Professor Thorson. Robert Thorson is professor and interim department head of geosciences at UConn. He holds an MS from the University of Alaska and a PhD from the University of Washington, which he earned while working as a geologist for the U.S. Geological Survey in Seattle. Professor Thorson has held teaching appointments at the University of Wisconsin, the University of Alaska, Yale University, Dartmouth College, the Universidad Técnica de Federico Santa Maria in Valparaiso, Chile, and Harvard University. He's taught at UConn since 1984, and in addition to being a research scientist and academic, he is an essayist and award-winning author, most recently of The Guide to Walden Pond. So thanks so much for being here with me. I'm so excited to share our exhibition with everybody who's here today. So I am going to share my screen, and I will be talking a little bit, let's see, I seem to have actually managed to close the file that I was going to share. All right, so I'm going to share some of the images of works that are in the exhibition, and also talk a little bit about the process of putting it together. So this is a curricular exhibition, and that just means that it supports teaching of a particular course and also offers a point of entry into that course for the campus and also the larger community. So I thought I would start by sharing the course description from the course catalog. So the course is a new geosciences course. And it's part of a series that's designated E, so it fulfills a new requirement that's asks students to engage with classes related to the environment. So this is a class that focuses on human activities as agents of geologic change, examines human planetary processes in our current epoch, the Anthropocene, and provides a novel frame for contemporary environmental issues such as climate change, sustainability, mass extinctions, land use, and waste disposal interaction between earthly processes and human affairs. And so for me, this last sentence of the course description was really the place that I started when Professor Thorson and I were talking about putting together this exhibition, thinking about this relationship between nature and people. And of course, in art terms, the starting point ended up being landscape. So I was thinking about landscape. Another sort of element that I needed to kind of figure out had to do with the time frame. So, you know, when are these artworks going to be from? And as we'll be talking about a little bit more, the dates for the Anthropocene are somewhat disputed. Some people are thinking about it in terms of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It seems like it's coming into focus more that the starting point is really 1950. And so the work that I chose as the kind of opening point, at least in my thinking about the exhibition, is this painting, William Lewis Sontag's Blue Ridge Wilderness. So a work from about a century before the sort of official start date of the Anthropocene, a work whose creation sort of coincides with the publication of Henry David Thoreau's Walden in 1854, and also the start of the US petroleum industry in 1859. Sontag was a member of the Hudson River School, a group of New York-based landscape painters. And I think that this is a great example of how artworks can really reveal attitudes about nature. And so there's 3 points that I want to talk about in relation to this painting that end up being relevant throughout the exhibition. The first one has to do with the little tiny people that you might notice in the foreground of the painting. There's appear to be 3 white men, and they seem to be fishing. And their presence here gives us a sense of the enormity of this landscape, the sort of sublime of nature. And this was a driving force behind the Hudson River School artists. The second thing that I want to point out just has to do with the title, Blue Ridge Wilderness, and this idea of wilderness, of course, ironically, during a time of rapid industrialization, was another big attraction for the Hudson River School artists and also their patrons. And then finally, the fact that this is not a specific place. This is not a real place. This is a constructed landscape. So Sontag had gone out on sketching trips through the Shenandoah River Valley. And, you know, here he is putting together elements from his sketches and sort of assembling them into this ideal landscape. So right from the beginning, you know, thinking about how nature is this sort of construction, and certainly landscape doesn't exist without people as this kind of framing element. And so Sontag ends up being totally relevant to this photograph by Beata Gutschau. This is the most contemporary artwork included in the exhibition, her LS number 14, Landschaft, number 14, landscape. She's a German artist, and she essentially builds her photographs up in Photoshop. So kind of updating the Hudson River School for the current moment, using photographs that she's taken of actual places and assembling elements from them together using the ideals of landscape painting from, maybe a European artist a generation before the Hudson River School. And, kind of thinking about this construction, also thinking about these notions of the sublime, maybe Gutschau is making a scene that's a little more picturesque. An artist like Laurie Nix is certainly engaged in this idea of the sublime, the power of nature. But here we're looking at not an actual scene, but another construction, a scale model that she has photographed. And this is what her practice that she and her partner have built up really consists of. And so this is from a series called Accidentally Kansas. And, I just love how, she kind of takes this idea of the power of nature and frames it in a way that I think is maybe a little more relevant to our contemporary moment, and certainly thinking about the increase of storms brings in climate change into the narrative here. So the last of the sort of constructed landscapes that I wanted to talk about is this photograph by Ansel Adams. And Adams was a photographer, very important in American photography from the first half of the 20th century, an advocate for environmental conservation. And so he certainly has a role in an exhibition like this one. But one of the things that I think is so interesting about Adams is in this particular photo, what he's kind of done with it. So a sublime image, one where we can look at a quote, something that Adams has actually said about this photograph in particular. So he says, "I've often thought what a privilege it would be to live and work in this environment, perhaps best before the turn of the century, when the efforts of man brought more beauty to the land than now, with our pavements, wires, contrails, and desolation. This photograph suggests a more agreeable past and may remind us that with a revived dignity and reverence for the earth, more of the world might look like this again." So he is idealizing the landscape through this statement, but he's also done this in practice as well. So high school students from Lone Pine, and apologies for the typo in the slide, had put the letters LP in white on the slope of the hill towards the left part of this image. And Adams actually removed those letters from the negative, and then he would spot them out from the print in the darkroom because it so offended him that, this scene had been sort of destroyed. So for him, it really disrupted, the beauty and the perfection of the scene. We can look at this too from a kind of Anthropocene lens, noting the year, 1944. Adams actually took this photo when he's out on assignment photographing the Manzanar relocation camp. But we're also mindful of the atomic bomb that is being developed at this time. And then actually deployed in Japan as this kind of marker of really the Anthropocene. So I have a few other groups of images that I wanted to share, and I'll try to move through them relatively quickly. This sort of constructed landscape, these ideas of the sublime, I mean, this was sort of a starting place for me. I also looked at works of art in the collection, and these are all objects from the Benton's collection, that showed traces of human impact and also different ways of looking at the environment. So this wonderful, really small etching, roadway near Nyack Turnpike. I sort of love the idea that there's such a thing as a turnpike in 1880. And, you know, thinking a little bit about these histories of technology. So this is 1880, 1885, we have Carl Benz patenting the first automobile powered by gas. So, you know, at this moment, that turnpike is really there for horses and carts. Thomas Pollock Anschutz, here bringing in the railroad. And Professor Thorson, in his thinking about this painting, sort of contrasts the river and the railroad, and kind of thinks about the way that the river, you know, probably would overtake the railroad here at some point. But the kind of tension of you know, who is going to sort of prevail at this particular moment is certainly part of this painting, where, you know, the railroad itself is really just this track sort of off to the side. You oftentimes have Reginald Marsh included in exhibitions at the Benton, and we have a huge collection of Marsh's prints. Here, his image of the George Washington Bridge from the Palisades on the New Jersey side, I probably would not have thought much about this print without the frame of this exhibition. And oftentimes we're thinking about Marsh as this great, you know, kind of chronicler of New York City. But he's contrasting the bridge, which was new, relatively new at this time, with the Palisades, you know, the great rocks there, and then also these wonderful hikers right in the foreground. So again, kind of thinking about these ideas of human impact, engineering, this kind of geological time that we see in the Palisades. And then this aerial perspective. So Marilyn Bridges' journey in Monument Valley, an aerial photographer, here taking a photo right at dawn with this raking light. And we can see from this aerial perspective, the roadway that just seems like it's in a really kind of impossible landscape to be traveling through. Certainly one that, you know, there is pretty inhospitable. We don't have another sign of people in sight. And then from there, thinking about the landscape transformed by humans. Wilson Henry Irvine's Old New England, this really picturesque, really harmonious image, but one that also shows us deforestation and even all of the effort that it would take to pull the rocks out of the land and then make them into this rock wall, as Professor Thorson has written about. Ernest Lawson's Low Tide, another image of harmony, but also giving us a sense of New York City and the landscape around it right at the turn of the 20th century. So here, this marsh that we know is going to be drained, and, you know, one day we'll have huge buildings on top of it, and this really wonderful boat in this painting, Lawson's work, oftentimes it seems like someone has just kind of walked out and left the scene, and we definitely see that here. And so thinking about the transformed landscapes, Joseph Pennell's coal mine, Longport from 1909, Pennell, making this image that we might look at and immediately feel, sort of horrified by. But for Pennell, it's a record of what he called the wonder of work. He was an American living in England. He had been on assignment in the US, making images of skyscrapers. He visits Pittsburgh and happens to see one of Carnegie's steel mills, and he sees it as this revelation. And so he makes a whole series of prints focusing on industry in Pennsylvania, the sort of industrial sublime as a counterpart to the sublime that we're looking at right at the beginning of the slides. And then Robert Aller, a work from his Transfigured Landscape series, where we see that impact of human labor, but almost a kind of aftermath, an update on Pennell several decades later. And this sort of dichotomy between the formal beauty of this image, which is very carefully framed, and then also this kind of spoiled landscape, the scars from excavation that will probably never be erased. And so that's a transition to the last group of works that I wanted to talk about, a group that I sort of called Anthropocene Life. So works that show us post-1950 America for the most part, although it's interesting to me that none of these artists knew they were living in the Anthropocene. Almost none of the works in the exhibition post-date the year 2000, when this human epoch was first sort of designated. So a gas line from 1979, Britta Jashinsky's polar bear, an activist photographer who's really interested in the fate of wildlife, but within this sort of frame of the Anthropocene, the polar bear definitely takes on a different kind of significance. And another image, this photograph by Craig Varjabedian, a really fantastic photo for a show like this one, where we're looking at this monument at the Trinity nuclear test site. And here, a work that brings us to the year 2000, a photo by Todd Hito, a whole series of suburban houses at night, images that he's taken. This one in Levittown, really the paragon for suburbia across the United States. And so I will close my presentation with the artwork that for me was sort of the great discovery of putting together this exhibition. A print by an American artist, George Bunker, this landscape. And I just loved the beauty of the colors. When I looked at it, I thought it had some interesting things to say about geology and landscape. I think it's interesting to bring abstraction into an exhibition like this one. and then learning a little bit more about a bunker, an artist whose main subject really was landscape, and an artist who was interested in kind of translating the sensuous terms of the world around us into abstract art. And one of a work that dates to the first year that he moved from Philadelphia to the American Southwest. And we can definitely see that in the colors that he's using here. So I will stop sharing and ask Professor Thorson if he'd sort of give some remarks.
Well, the first thing I better do is unmute, and I just did that. Thank you, Amanda.
All right.
Am I okay? You can hear me? Can you see me? I always have to check because sometimes it doesn't work. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a lot of fun. It's always interesting to me to listen to somebody talking about paintings, because I don't know a whole lot about art history other than it's important, and I like it. But when I see an image, I'm immediately struck by, my own training and my own background and my own lens. And so for every one of the images that she's shown, there is a caption, or if that's what you call it, that I've written on the exhibit. And it's really quite divergent from what Amanda pointed out. And yet they complement each other in a really interesting way. So you want me to give a presentation? I decided to throw together some slides, and my task was to pick slides that have nothing to do with the exhibition. I just want to pull images from the course, just some of the images from the course to show you, because they're quite different from the ones that we picked. And the original conception of this for me was to just, I really, really like to bring my students into the art museum. In whatever classes. And it's because I have sort of this thesis. It's an informal thesis that's not original with me. But the basic idea is that scientists often come up with stuff that's really important. But if nobody pays attention until they're emotionally engaged in art in one form or another, whether it's literature or dance or art or music or whatever, once you get people engaged, then they can actually begin to take issue if it's, for example, an environmental issue. And then that's not far enough, because if you don't hand it off to the social sciences, or you just never end up with policies at all and laws. And so there's this lead from science that then goes to me into the humanities, that then goes into the social sciences, that's required for any political action. And as Jed Purdy, somebody that I really like to read, and he's in the exhibit, said that the environment is something everybody takes for granted now. But it wasn't a thing, until the mid-1960s. It had to be named before it became a thing. And then the naming of it creates a paradigm shift, that allows us to focus on one thing, the big thing that holds all these other things. And in the same way, the Anthropocene, as an epoch of time, a real geologic epoch, our own, is the one big thing, that holds all of these problems that we're trying to deal with, specifically climate change, ecosystem collapse, human disruptions, overpopulation, all of this stuff. Those are pieces, they're big pieces, but they're within something big, and we don't really know what to call it, because it's whatever it is, it's bigger than the environment. So we're looking for a shift, and usually it'll be the artists that lead our way into it. So now what I'm going to try and do is share my screen, and I'm not positive if it'll look as nice as hers, but because you'll probably get my whole screen, full of emails and stuff like that. But we'll see if you can get the images. And Amanda, please, I see you're muted now, but let me know when you can see them, or at least nod. Whoops, I got to share it. There. Can you see that, Amanda? Okay, good. There we go. I think you have presenter view. So ignore the right-hand corner. We didn't figure this technology out. So this is just my opening slide. It's the one that you've shown. This was put together in the Benton Museum. I think it's quite interesting. This is really a key image. It's a before and after image. If you're going to name an epoch, that's an official formal period of time, not a period, but an epoch. In other words, an interval of time. And let's not worry about when it began. But basically the idea is that we had an ice sheet, we had glaciation, and then we began civilization, and then we had a Holocene, which is the previous epoch. And it went on and on and on for about 11,700 years. And then all of a sudden, something really, really, really big happened. We started getting the power of petroleum and fossil fuels, and we began a makeover on the planet. And here is a reconstructed image of Manhattan, what it looked like before, by which I mean, in this case, probably the 16th century, 17th century, and then after, and what it looks like today. So that concept of before and after is critical to the Anthropocene, because it isn't a feeling, it's an epoch, an official block of geologic time. And the argument is that things are so darn different, since about 1950. Or you could say since the Industrial Revolution, or you could say seafaring colonialism, or you could say the birth of civilization. The bottom date doesn't really matter. What matters is that the world now, the Earth now, is so different that every self-respecting geologist has to say, well, there's a new agency operating, something new is going on. We haven't had this in 4.6 billion years. We better invent a new epoch to hold it. And so that's fundamentally what the Anthropocene is. It's an official block of time that has been proposed and dated for 20 years, and we're near the end of certifying it globally. And on the right, you'll see a beautiful image, of planet Earth. It's one of these NASA images. But on the left, you will see this image substituted into a detail from the creation of Adam by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And if that isn't art history, I don't know what it is. But my interest is in the yellow arrows. And so in the original mythology, or in the mythology that some still follow, the Bronze Age mythology is that a bearded god, basically creates Adam. That's in mythology. Go to the next panel down. Following the Origin of Species and the Descent of Man by Charles Darwin, beginning in 1859, we had a rather different conception of what happened. This is why it was so shaken, is that what happens is it's the Earth that is creating evolution, or creating humans through evolution. That's why it was so dangerous. It replaced the top panel with the middle panel. And now we've moved to something quite different. And this is globally only since about 1950, with the great acceleration of consumption. What we now have is technology changing the planet, not changing it here, digging a latrine, or throwing your waste somewhere, or building a city or a road or a coliseum or anything. Nothing small like that. We're talking about a makeover of the whole thing, including that blue atmosphere that is warming the climates. And I might remind you that the climate change is plural because climates are by definition regional. So you're not changing a climate, you're changing the climates, plural, on planet Earth. And what's changing that? What's changing that is technology. But fundamentally, all climate change comes from underground via the geology. Now, you may not know what this is, but they moved Spirit Rock. Spirit Rock at Yukon is that rock that has many, many layers of paint. It was originally found and moved during the Torrey Life Sciences construction, and then it's gone in various places, but now it's being permanently installed back on the Northwest campus. And this is just last summer, I believe, moving Spirit Rock. But look at all the power and the energy and the thought and the thing to move one rock. And yet 2 epochs ago in the Pleistocene, the ice sheet would move that rock and a billion other ones without giving it much thought. So essentially what we're doing in the Anthropocene is using energy beyond our puny skeletal existence, to reshape the planet in whatever way we want. And here we're simply moving Spirit Rock to a new place. So the word environment is too small. What is it? That thing that surrounds us is literally what it means. Yes, and we have environmental this and we have environmental that. And in our courses bear that name, and the departments involve that name, and it's fine. It's still a great name. And it will be a good name for, the next 20 years or so. But down the road, it's going to be too small because everything is impacted. Everything. This beautiful scene is impacted by the next scene, which is this one. 1951, plutonium charged in the atmosphere through atomic bomb testings. So we're looking for a paradigm shift. We're looking for some word or some phrase or some action, that will allow us to rethink what we mean by the environment. It is utterly global right now. This is northern Vermont. Every single peak has been climbed. Most of that forest has been cut and returned. All right. The atmosphere has got double the carbon content it had during the Ice Age, and we're half again more carbon than it had before. That's acidifying the air. That's warming the globe. That's modifying everything. There's the bomb plutonium in every old tree here. Every old tree has it. Every soil, every lake bed, every increment of sediment there has some trace of human activity. You cannot escape it anywhere on the globe. And without being, too negative, and I'm not being negative, this is a metaphor I'm going to show you, not an activity, a golf course. I think it's helpful to consider, the entire surface of the planet, not the interior of the planet, the surface of the planet like a golf course. In other words, everything is modified in some way by our choices. Everything, even the bone driest deserts. They're bone dry because we've chosen not to irrigate them. The wilderness lands that we put away aren't really wilderness, okay? But they're basically places that we've decided to leave alone. They're set-asides. But that's a human choice that does that. Or we could just go in and take it. Now, this scene is interesting. It's just the basic nearest golf course. And by the way, I don't play golf. But what happens is that this was all farm, and then it was all forest, and then it was a golf course. And before it was farm, it was a forest. So it's gone from forest to farm to forest to golf course, and who knows where it's going to go in the next 50 years or so. But everything there is changed on a gradient from left alone, as in the upper left corner, to the rough, to the fairways, to the aprons, to the greens, and to the hole. That's a gradient of change that human beings have impacted on this landscape. And it's all deliberate. Even the set-asides, even the woods that are gathering golf balls every summer. Hence, we need a beginning for this epic. If we're going to say that the planet today is different from all previous planetary intervals of time, and I'll use the word epic here, we need to find a bottom for it. That's been a real challenge for the Anthropocene, because we'd like to think that all that good old archaeology would fall under the Anthropocene. The problem with all big archaeologies, even the origins of civilizations, even the extinction of faunas, for example, in Australia at 45,000 years ago, when we had a whole new extinction. The problem with those are they're not global. And geologic epochs require a global boundary that is recognizable everywhere. And the best one we have here, called a global stratigraphic stratotype and point, okay? The golden spike, so to speak. That's a real thing, plugged into a former epoch in geologic history. What we're looking for is a marker. When did the Anthropocene begin and end? And when, well, we don't have an end yet, but when did it begin? It has to be global. And the best candidate for that is right around the mid 20th century. 1950 is the rounded date, okay? And that is identified by brand new chemicals, brand new plastics, colossal disruptions, from the sort of chemical cycles, and plutonium everywhere, as dust that fell. And that's why we hid under our seats in school in the early 1960s. Now, I'm just going to bring up a few things. Just consumption of energy. It's really cool to be Top Gun. It's really cool to have these flyovers. It's really great to celebrate military victories. It's really whatever, it's all very cool, but the energy consumption is extraordinary. And I just wanted to say a jet fighter plane will burn 385 gallons per minute, 23,000 gallons of fuel per hour, or 6 gallons per second. And so when you see one of these flyovers, you could actually calculate, the carbon load of them. And we do this often without thinking, but if you start calculating the load, it's pretty easy to see why the climate has changed. This is an extraordinary, not the greatest piece of artwork, but it's in 2019 is the reference. And it's put together by the Minerals Education Coalition. They want you to know how much stuff you use, or if you're my age, my grandchildren is going to use in their lifetime. And this is approximately what you used in your lifetime, but maybe a little less. Importantly, let's say we have a brand new baby right now. What will they consume in their life? They will consume 1.36 million pounds of stone, sand, and gravel. They will consume 75,000 gallons of petroleum. How about just basic coal? 330,000 pounds. That would be you and every other person on the planet who has this sort of lifestyle. Iron ore, 20,000 pounds for each baby? We don't think about that because it's in cities and guardrails and structures. Cement, 53,000 pounds. And on and on and on. The idea is that every American born, in 2019 will need so much stuff just to live with the life that we live. And that so much stuff requires that it's mined and shipped and transported and moved. It's just our lifestyle. And here's the biggest digger bringing us some of that stuff. This is the biggest excavator known. The thing that you see on the lower left there is one of those giant yellow machine excavators. So this is truly colossal. The excavating wheel is 7 stories tall. It's a German digger for strip mining coal, and it moves 8.5 million cubic feet per day. Now, you could argue, well, why consider human beings a geologic agent? Well, forgetting the chemistry, forgetting the radioactivity, forgetting climate change, forgetting all of that, if you just try to calculate how much material human beings move, per day on the planet, it turns out to be way more at a way higher rate than ice sheets move their materials. And it's about 10 times the rate of the average movement of materials in the last 500 million years. So averaged over 2 million years or averaged over 500 million years, human beings are moving 5 to 15 times the rate of all other geologic processes. So therefore, we are a process. Think Mount Rushmore. That's a process, shaping that mountain. And I like this slide because it's a New England cranberry bog. And what I want to point out here is that human beings, that is the agriculture of making the cranberry bog, were simply the third geologic agent to change this place, in the last 30,000 years. In the Pleistocene epoch, the official Pleistocene, the Ice Age, if you like, we basically have a meltdown block of glacial ice to create a small lake, a kettle lake. And then what happens? The next agency to come is the Holocene ecosystem. And we create a bog, through biogeochemical cycling and ecology. So we end up with the bog. The bog comes from the kettle in its own epoch. It's the dominant agency is ecosystem development. And the third agency in its own epoch is the Anthropocene agriculture. So it's still a nice looking photo to me. There's nothing inherently wrong. If you strip away your value judgments, my point is you have 3 subsequent epochs. Each one has its own dominant agency, and the Earth looks the way it does because of the sequence of those epochs. In this case, the ice sheet kettle during the Pleistocene, the ecosystem bog during the Holocene epoch, and then the agricultural development in the Anthropocene epoch. The global stuff and the local stuff are not the same. We need to realize there's a global boundary, and I don't worry about it too much. It's still being voted on, but the vote was, I believe, 29 versus 3 to make it real and to make it 1950. Nice picture of the Earth. taken, I think, from Reed Weissman from the space station. And there's the Earth at night. I think you can see that we have really spread all over and lit it up. And most of that light is coming from, coal and gas electrical generation, some from nuclear, and a very precious little from renewables. Of course that has to happen. Of course that has to happen. But it's complex. Bureaucracy. Oh, why don't we have an Anthropocene epic, even though it was first suggested in 2000? The answer is international committees. Ultimately, geologists are going to decide this, but the artists have run away with it. The journalists have run away with it already. They're having a blast. And the conservationists don't really like it, because basically by saying, if you have an Anthropocene, it means we didn't conserve what was here before. And but if you think about the bureaucracy, the International Union of Geological Sciences has a commission called the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and they have a subcommission on the stratigraphy, or the layering and the keeping track of dates and epochs, in the last 2 million years. And they have a working group for coming up with a name and a date for the Anthropocene, and there's 33 people on it. 29 of them vote to make it 1950. So the emergence, how do we know this thing? Well, let's just not worry about all of this, but let's just go right to the end. We are doing serious grappling with disruption and climate change in the last decade. Before that, in 2010, we recognized the Great Acceleration that started in 1950. In 2000 is when the Anthropocene was first proposed, and it was uttered spontaneously by the Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen, at a meeting. And before that, we had all kinds of thinking that was about global things, but it really got serious about 2000. And I think that's the end of my slides. So that means I'm going to stop my screen share. I made it through my slides. I hope you learned something from them. And I'm very interested in questions. And I haven't timed it, so I don't know how much time I used, but it's gone. Speaking about time, it's gone. Yeah, so it's on to you, Amanda.
So we're happy to take questions in the Q&A box if you want to type them in. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this course, kind of talking with you about it, and also reading, some of the course book, is this way that it's intended to address eco-anxiety.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
If you'd like me to comment on that. Yeah, I was quite surprised by that. Basically, the way the course is structured is we open with a standard introduction like a syllabus, and then we deal with some of the human issues. They're not really geological issues, or how the Earth works. But then fundamentally, we get down to a place where we call how the Earth works. And we basically do a primer on basic geoscience, how the Earth works. Where does the climate come from? How has it changed? Where does it move? What happens on planet Earth? And when we're done with that, then we launch into the human makeover. And we have a unit on the human makeover. And when that is done, like the golf course analogy. And when we get past that, we move into the human futures, and we look back on the present from the future. And that's the part the students really, really are interested in, because naming a geologic epoch presumes that it will end someday, because every other epoch has ended someday. And there's a new book called Deep Time Reckoning that tries to imagine, the Finnish have been working on this to try and imagine what will the world look like 250 or even a million years, 250,000 or a million years from now, deep time in the future. And so we ask our students to do that. And what they find is that knowing that the planet has been here forever and we're not going to, wreck the planet, we're going to change the surface. And we have the power to change it. We certainly have the power to unchange it, notwithstanding the serious consequences of climate change, which are very real, that we've put into motion, and we have to do adaptation now rather than, basically avoidance. So I'm not really political about climate change. It's a very serious concern, but the idea is climate change occurs inside of something else. And learning a little bit about climate change, that is what its extremes have been over geologic time and why it even exists in the first place, is immensely comforting to students that don't have any clue how the climate actually works. And so it's a little bit of information or a little bit of understanding reduces that anxiety. For example, the origin of our primates, took place at a under earthly climates 25 degrees warmer than today. And what that means, it's not that that's a good thing for us, because we would certainly melt all the ice sheets and migrate from the shores. It's not that that's not a good thing. It's that the earth didn't disappear. The earth didn't go blank. And it's when you look at the whole earth and you realize that it's a vanity to think that we're going to wreck the planet. That's insane. The planet has been here for 4.6 billion years. We are modifying the highly derived systems on its surface. The fundamental units on its surface are going to stay just fine. So for some reason, they really, really felt better after the course. And hey, if I can make them less anxious and less worried, good. And I'm basically very interested in the environment. I mean, I've been doing it my whole life, but I'm post-environment. I mean, it sounds silly, but there's something even bigger than the environment. And if you look at and we just don't know what to call it yet. And the Anthropocene is the best thing we've come up with right now. The recognition that human beings are not impacting here and there, the whole surface is different because of our choices. So for some reason, it makes them less anxious. And I think just a little bit of knowledge helps, which is appropriate for a 1,000-level introductory course.
Well,
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, and one that's has like a couple hundred students in it every semester.
Oh,
so
yeah. I could tell you a little bit about the history of this course. I mean, we piloted the course as an e-course. The other intro geology courses were too scientific, I guess, to qualify for the E designation. So I said, well, let's just make one that's really, that would be all about that. And that's where this course came from. And when we piloted the course, because of delays, we missed registration, and it went from about 40 in drop ad, to it overfilled at 70. And then we offered it the next semester, and we said, well, there's 180 students in it, and it's just getting started. And then we decided to offer an honors core version of it, and bingo, it's full already. We have 2 sections this spring, and one is completely full. No, 3 are completely full, and one is filling. We're only halfway through registration. And they're using the same course book and the same basic layout that we created for an online class. And we would call that a success not because we're putting butts in seats. We call that a success because the students are actually interested in it and want to learn more and feel better when they're done. The planet is, because I think what it does is it removes some of the guilt, that we're doing something bad to something else. Well, no, there is no something else. The whole thing is us right now. And yes, there's still lots of wildness. I mean, there's actually more wildness now than there used to be. If you define wildness as something beyond human control, that could be scary. But the idea is we pulse these changes, and now we're experiencing the ramifications of them in ways like the wildfires of California, or how about the sharks on Cape Cod? I mean, those are both the consequences of human action, but they're wild responses to deliberate things that we've done. On the one hand, warm the atmosphere deliberately. On the other one, protect the seals, which are basically shark food. So this is our doing. And we don't name an epic out of vanity that, oh, we're cool, we want to have an epic named after us. No, we're just the dominant geologic agent. That's it.
Yeah.
And then that makes people realize, oh, if we're a dominant geologic agent in one direction, we can do it in another direction. I think it gives them hope.
Hmm. So
we got four
now
Q&As there.
we have some questions. So a question from Allison Paul about the show as a whole. If artists have tended to either remove evidence of what humans have done to the environment or idealize our industrial achievements. So is this the norm, or is this just a phenomena of, you know, the works that we chose for the exhibition? I mean, you know, when the show itself is sort of drawn specifically from the Benton's collection, so you know, you have the limits of just what's in the collection, but I think, you know, from just processing a lot of these images, that you have a huge impulse towards idealization really up until you know, the dawn of the environmental movement. And then there's a shift in the late 60s, early 70s, where there is more, you know, artists are talking more about their anxiety. You know, they're kind of letting in more of this kind of critical lens. And you know, part of that, I think, is just how some of these attitudes really track with larger attitudes that are held by you know, the just kind of people as a whole. Professor Thorson, what do you think?
Well, I go back to the origins of the sort of environmental movement, and there's really two main threads, and one thread is the aesthetic thread. You know, about you know, the environment. We're going to protect the environment, you know, for spiritual reasons, for beautiful reasons of beauty, for reasons of whatever. And the other one is the conservation thread that really comes out of utility, you know, to use it. And I think that if we realize that if it's really hard to explain this because it's such a big idea, it's hard to get your brain around it, that if we can come to the realization that we've reshaped the planet and it's now ours, we can let go of the idealized views of what it might have been. And then we can also realize, oh, we're in charge. You know, we really are in charge. And there are wild responses that we want to avoid. So we should become more expert, more careful, more willful, you know, in our, quote, environmental management, when it's really just planetary management. Mm. You know, because the word environment means what surrounds you. So wherever you are, it's your ego in your skull, you know, and you look around, that's your environment. Now the label environment it's an ism, you know, like existentialism, you know, it's an ism. It's a big squishy thing, and it was a really important ism, and I want another ism to replace it. I mean, you know, you know, Bill McKibben wrote that groundbreaking book, the End of Nature, in the 80s or something like that, and he was onto something. I hated the title, but really what it is that there's an end to the wishful thinking that the environment is something out there, you know, that isn't us. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a panel on the wall of the museum by Jed Purdy, and I forget what it is, but you know, what is nature? Well, ask what is human nature, you know, and then ask, is nature different from environment? And then ask, is environment different from planet? And you get all these questions with no real good answers, but those are the ones that the students love to grapple with. And they have visits to the Benton, they go to the cemetery, they go to the, you know, they go to the library, they just go different places and they write it up and they work in teams and they have discussion sections and they have homework assignments and they have writing prompts. They just have all kinds of things. And every step of the way, they're grappling with questions like I just presented to you, and I don't have all the answers. And the key thing to remember is that the word Anthropocene is really, really growing. It's now continuing to accelerate in its adaptation, like a meme. It's a cultural meme. And the word environment is actually peaked, and it's starting to go down a little bit. It'll still be around for a long time, and it's still a very useful word because everybody knows what it is, and there's a lag time between what the body politic is interested in doing and what some of the futurists are thinking. So I'm fine with, but I'm just calling into question how do you have environmental impact on something that is something you made, like the planet? And I'm not suggesting that you can't have wild lands grow back and be gorgeous and beautiful. And I'm not extinctions is a whole nother thing. We're just trying to have students understand what's the history of the Earth. How did this biodiversity happen? How rapidly does it change? There are 6 mass extinctions. What caused them? Just background information really provides the context for all environmental issues. I mean, if you think about it, all of the climates that have ever existed on the Earth come from underground. Yes, they manifest up in the air, right? But they're created by wherever the continents and the ocean basins are, and those shift around on the planet, okay? And the climates change depending on how the Earth wobbles or tilts, and the climates change depending on the chemistry of the atmosphere. And when you put those factors together, they all come from sort of internal geothermal forces. I went off there. Sorry about that.
Well, we had a couple of additional questions. One that got shot to the top of the list, if there's required or recommended readings, like Elizabeth Kolber's The Sixth Extinction. And I had actually thought about adding some recommended readings to the the website for the exhibition.
That's a good one. That's a good one. She's just, it won the Pulitzer. That's, who am I to say whether that's good or bad? It wins a Pulitzer. It's very, very spot on. The problem with that, for me, is that you can't have that title unless you know what the previous extinctions are all about and what caused them. And they're all non-human. And they're all important, and they all reshaped the biota on the planet, and they all ushered in a brand new epoch, you see? That's the key. Every single one of those 6 extinctions ushered in a new epoch. So are they good or bad? If we didn't have the 5th extinction, not the 6th, if we didn't have the 5th, we wouldn't be here, because that's the one that took out the dinosaurs and allowed the mammals within 1 million years of that asteroid bombardment and the volcanic degassing, that whole constellation of things that created that massive disruption. Without that, within 1 million years, mammals were already twice the size that they had been for 100 million years. In other words, they began to take over the daytime terrestrial niche on the planets. And it's extraordinary when you think about what happened to mammals, in the last 65 million years. And that is all a consequence of that 5th extinction. And so the 6th extinction then asked the question, yes, we're the agent of that extinction. Is it good or bad? Well, I happen to think it's bad because of the rates and because of the issues. But, let's think about that. That's indeed a value judgment, isn't it? For every organism alive today, there's probably, many, many more that are extinct. And the average large-bodied creature like us, I think, lasts just a couple million years. And we've been at it, about that. They don't last. Organisms originate and they go extinct. It's a steady pattern, just like life and death, all the way through the history of life.
So the last question that we have has to do with your expectations for when the Anthropocene becomes official. So do you think this term will lead to some positive action, or is it, just more for educational purposes?
I think that we're already there in terms of the political action and I think you're right. I think when it's official, I think that there'll be a news story and maybe people will feel more confident in using it. But what's important for me is not, well, let's put it this way. The vote was already 29-4, in favor of making it 1950. And the reason it's stalling is they can't figure out what the most significant basal boundary is. And that's because people don't want to have archaeology happen before, the Anthropocene. They want it as part of the Anthropocene. I certainly do, because of the stone walls in New England that I've been fascinated with. But the problem with that is that all epochs must be global. There has to be a uniform global boundary, and nothing comes close to it except the atomic bomb testing and detonations, and then the Great Acceleration. I mean, plastic really didn't exist. It existed, but you couldn't find it in many stores. They had what were called tin cans because they were still made of tin cans. I mean, the amount of change in human population, in energy consumption, in synthetic products, in everything, really, really ramps up and accelerates exponentially beginning around 1950. And that is now very, very well-tested idea. That's the logical place, to put the boundary of a truly global epoch without disqualifying regional human impacts. And I can still call them Anthropocene. They're just not official Anthropocene. And I think that the artists have already run wild with it. If I went to the Mansfield Town Library, that's not a big library, it's a good one. And I just hit their search engine and I put Anthropocene books and I got 85 hits. That was last year.
Wow.
And there are, it's all over art magazines. If you just Google Anthropocene, you go everywhere. And there's tons of disinformation about it. But I know that the media has sort of, especially the creative writing media, it's just really latched onto it. And I'm not even talking about whether it's good or bad. I just want good information. If we're in a truly different epoch, if we're in a truly different planet surface and it's unique in Earth history, I want a new epoch, just like the one after the dinosaurs. And all of us think that, but that's not the big deal. That's a technicality within the geosciences. But the ramification of that idea become really, really important. And that's when the literature, art, and writing, and film, and video, and all of that take over, and social media. And that was the point that I made initially, is that a panel of scientists from the International Commission of Stratigraphic Nomenclature can say, okay, we're in the Anthropocene, but it goes absolutely zero. It doesn't go anywhere until it taps human emotions and engages them. And when you do that, then there's movement. And if there's a movement, then you need, some kind of policy, government control, regulation, whatever. It's just a handoff from the scientific recognition to the engagement of the emotion, which I would call it through art, into the governance of that big thing, in our society, which I would call social science. And then it goes right back to the scientists to help with that process. And so I really think there's a wonderful dialogue between that three-legged stool, we call progress or change.
Well, that'll have to be our next exhibition, the show of the art that's made maybe since 2000 that kind of addresses this sort of issue, which is not something that we were able to tap into from the collection, but it would be a really different looking exhibition, I think. But
and I think I sense it in that you sent me a couple of of articles, and I looked up a few. I read some of the art history, and the artists are just like, there's a lot of anxiety and fear and concern about planet ending, this and that. But every self-respecting geoscientist knows the planet isn't going to end. We're disrupting the surface, and we can undisrupt it as long as we understand it. And so replacing fear with understanding is really the goal of the class, and that's why students are less anxious. They replace fear with understanding.
Yeah. Well, Professor Thorson, I want to thank you so much for the conversation, and also for all the work that you put into the exhibition. I would encourage all of you to visit the Benton website. You can read all of the texts, the commentary from myself and Professor Thorson about the works that are in the exhibition. The exhibition will be up through next Friday in the galleries, and then the Benton will close along with the rest of UConn's campus through winter recess. But the exhibition will still be up from the start of the spring semester until March 13th. So if you'd like to come and see the show in person, you'll have an opportunity to do so during the spring semester. And just a couple of housekeeping issues related to some upcoming programs. Our Critical Looking program, since the end of October, since the show opened, has been focused on works from the exhibition. So next week on Wednesday, 12:15 to 12:45, we'll be talking about a photograph from Yellowstone by Truman Ward Ingersoll. And then December, we have a couple events as well, talking about the Pennell print of the coal mine and also Ansel Adams' Winter Sunrise. So please join us for those programs. Critical Looking is an interactive dialogue that takes place over Zoom. So we just spend time really focusing on a single work of art. So I will leave it there. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
Yep. Yeah, thank you all for joining. It's been a pleasure. I really, really like the Benton.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.